Good evening and welcome to what we have been calling the debate of the century between Dr. Nigel Cameron and Dr. Peter Singer. My name is Jennifer Lahl and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Bioethics and Culture here in Oakland. We expect this to be a very interesting evening, a very enlightening evening, but most of all, we expect this to be an evening that will deeply impact each of you who is here tonight. The question to be debated tonight, what does it mean to be human, is of paramount importance. There are visionaries now who are talking about a post-human or a transhuman race. People are proposing to clone human beings either for reproduction or for research purposes. Our culture is divided on the abortion issue, and there are issues regarding the degree and the nature of medical treatment for those nearing the end of their lives, as well as for those who are disabled. Should we restrain scientific discovery? And what should be our ethical framework for understanding the boundaries that we put into place? In each of these very critical matters that affect our culture, our society, and our lives, this issue of what does it mean to be human is one of the central matters that must be taken into consideration. It gets beyond the symptom of differing views and addresses the fundamental and the foundational issues surrounding our humanness. The CBC is deeply aware of the strongly held viewpoints on both sides of tonight's debate. Each of these men tonight has much to say on these matters. Dr. Nigel Cameron is the executive chairman of the CBC. He is founder of the international journal Ethics in Medicine, executive chair of the Center for Bioethics and Public Policy in London, and dean of the Wilberforce Forum in Washington, D.C. He has testified before the United States Senate, has appeared frequently on television shows such as Nightline, and is the author of The New Medicine, Life and Death After Hippocrates. And he's also most recently served as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations Task Force on Human Cloning. It is our privilege to have him participate with us this evening's debate. Dr. Peter Singer is known worldwide for his seminal writings in the field of bioethics and his staunch defense of animal rights, and he holds a position at Princeton University as the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Center for Human Values. Among his many books are Animal Liberation, Rethinking Life and Death, and Writings on an Ethical Life. We are privileged to have him participate in this evening's debate. Michael Krasny is well known here in the Bay Area in his role as the host of KQED Forum on KQED FM radio, and is also an author and a professor of literature. Mr. Krasny will be serving as the moderator of this debate in a format that he and the debate principals have arranged and agreed upon, and we are very pleased to have his participation as our moderator. An archival videotape is being made of this event, and you will note from your program that no other photography or recordings are permitted this evening. There will be a time for questions from the audience, during which you will have an opportunity to bring questions to either Dr. Cameron or Dr. Singer. We know that the matters being discussed and debated tonight are very weighty. That is why we are putting on this event, and that many of you hold very strong convictions about them. Yet we ask for your graciousness, your courtesy, and your respect for all participants. Finally, the CBC would like to thank its co-organizer, Life Legal Defense Foundation, and our co-sponsors, the California Pro-Life Council, the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, First Resort, the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society, Respect Life Ministry, and the Wilberforce Forum. We thank them for their support and vision in helping us put together the debate of the century. I now give you Mr. Michael Krasny, who will explain the format and the rules by which this debate will be conducted.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to all of you. Delighted to have you here this evening for what promises to be certainly a fascinating debate. I think, just out of curiosity, how many of you heard the preliminary round on the radio on the forum program? Okay, great. Well, what we're going to do here this evening, actually, before I explain the rules or the ground rules, the title is "What Does It Mean to Be Human?" and it's being billed as the debate of the century. It's had a certainly a good deal of hyperbole attached to that. I imagine some of you would agree. We've got a big fight coming up this weekend between Tyson and Lewis, and this is not going to be along those pugilistic lines. We've got two gentlemen who are gentlemen in every sense of the word and who really know how to keep a debate on a higher level of discourse despite the fact that they are in strong and passionate disagreement with each other. And again, I would ask you to respect the civility here in the audience as well. I think both want to diminish suffering, both look at the world, however, through very different lenses. And they have both, however, agreed about one thing, and that is the structure of this debate. And what we're going to do is hear from each of them. I'll flip a coin. This is very much in the old American style of football, and whoever wins the coin toss will get to decide whether they want to go first or whether they want to extend the right to their opponent to go first. And then each will give a 10-minute opening statement, after which I will begin to ask them questions based not only on, of course, the content that they present, but also on many of the issues. Then we'll have the questions that many of you were kind enough to put forward here. We probably will get only to a selected number of them, so if we don't get to yours, my apologies ahead of time, but we'll do the best we can. And we will certainly have, I hope, a good wide range of questions from the audience. So without any further ado, we're going to begin, and let me begin by introducing the two who are vying for certainly not only your goodwill, but also to win you over and persuade you of their points of view, Drs. Peter Singer and Nigel Cameron. Please welcome them. Thank you kindly for that welcome, and I know that our participants appreciate it. Who would like to call the coin that I'm about to flip here? Would you like to take that?
Sure, I'll call it.
Okay. This is for Peter Singer. Call it in the air. Heads or tails?
Heads.
Tails it is, which means, Nigel Cameron, you get the decision as to who goes first here.
I shall be happy to go first.
Again, Nigel Cameron will have 10 minutes, at which time I will tell him that his 10 minutes is up, and then we'll hear 10 minutes from Peter Singer. So please proceed.
Let me offer you three propositions this evening. The first proposition is this: that at the heart of every culture, at the very root of every civilization, is a vision of what it means to be human, what it means to be one of us. This is true whether you live in a primitive tribal culture, whether you live in Islamic or Chinese civilization. It's true of every culture of the world around. It's true of secular societies as well as religious societies. There is a vision at the core of the culture of what it means to be one of us. And therefore, at the end of the day, every great cultural question reduces to this question, or to turn that statement around. The question of what it means to be human lies behind every great question debated in the culture. Now, I believe that to be true of all the great controversies around us, whether the controversy is about public education, about porn on the internet, about funding for healthcare, whether it's about euthanasia or abortion, whether it's about biotechnology, whether it's about the standards we have in our public life, the standards in our political life, truth-telling in business, Enron and Arthur Anderson. At the end of the day, every question ultimately depends upon your vision of what it means to be one of us, to be a member of this human community. And that is why so many issues are hard to address, hard to disagree and agree on, because we fail to see the question behind them. That is why these questions of human dignity in healthcare, questions of discrimination, questions of handicap, questions of the lives of the born and the unborn, questions of biotechnology, which all come so very close to the question of what it means to be human, are freighted with such fateful consequences and go to the very root of what our civilization is all about. My first point. Second point. The question of what it means to be human is being tried in our generation as it never has been for many hundreds of years. You see, we are the legatees of what we have been pleased to call Judeo-Christian civilization, of a culture founded over many hundreds of years on highly distinct moral and spiritual values. A culture founded on an amalgam of traditions, the great classical civilization of the ancient world, taken by the Jewish and Christian writers and thinkers, molded into the Christendom of the Middle Ages, out of which has come, in modern times, the nation-states of the West. Highly complex history, but through it all, running down now hundreds of years, at the heart of this civilization, a vision of human dignity, which is grand and glorious, a vision of human being made in the very image of God. And whether you are Christian or Jewish or Muslim, whether you are sacred or secular, whatever your religious, philosophical starting point today, you are the legatee and the beneficiary of that vision of human dignity, which has given rise in the Western tradition to the rule of law, to democracy, to the flowering of the dignity of the individual, and late in the day, in this last generation, to the second round in the debate about the ending of slavery, in the civil rights movement, in this last generation, to many of the good aspects of feminism and the recovery of the dignity of women, given rise to our concerns in our generation for those who are handicapped through ADA, through so many regulatory and policy positions, a recognition of the equal dignity before the law of those who have been considered to have equal dignity under God. In our generation, the most fateful questions being posed against the background of the flowering of our vision for human dignity and of our finding ourselves often the unwitting beneficiaries of this highly distinct Judeo-Christian moral vision in which the individual matters quite so much because the individual matters the God who made him or who made her. Thirdly, as to the future, we find ourselves at the watershed in the history of this civilization, the breakpoint of our culture. We find ourselves addressing fundamental questions which have not been addressed for many hundreds of years. And I think the issue of euthanasia perhaps has been the most evident of them all, because euthanasia was eschewed, euthanasia was prohibited, euthanasia was regarded as just about as bad a thing as could be in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as the abandonment of the sick, at the same time as the abandonment of our moral responsibility for ourselves. In this last generation, the prohibition on suicide has been overturned in our moral thinking, and euthanasia is advanced in Europe, practiced now in Holland, now in Belgium, the law, in Oregon here, our own sample euthanasia jurisdiction. A beginning of a reinvention of human nature, a decision that human nature may be disposed of, that we, in our autonomy, may end our own lives, and of course, by implication, that there are lives less worthy to be lived than other lives. The beginning of a development which, of course, in Germany in the 30s and 40s led to the world's great euthanasia regime, and leaves the German conscience as the great guide to our address of issues in medicine and biotechnology in the world today. Let the German conscience be your guide. As we look ahead, we look beyond issues like euthanasia and the status of the handicapped, the disabled, We look to the manipulative capacities of biotechnology, to cloning, to germline interventions that will change every generation, to these new powers we have taken to ourselves in the biosciences, which are being exploited not, as it were, within the academy and the professional scientific community, so much as within the IPO world of the biotech companies and venture capitalists, as the marketing of bioscience threatens to engulf and indeed fundamentally to change the whole character of our culture, because it has lost touch with this vision of human nature as that bearing the dignity of the God who has made us, because we have come to the view that human nature is now manipulable and is in our own hands, that we can not just dispose of ourselves in euthanasia, we can remake ourselves through biotechnology. So we may choose to clone ourselves, we may choose to have better babies, we may choose to find some way to dispense with inheritable disease, we may choose to make a post-human future in which human nature is something we control. We may choose to move beyond taking human life made in God's image into making human life in the image of ourselves. What does it mean to be human? To be human in our civilization has been a grand and glorious thing, because it has been to be made in the image of the God who made us. And religious or secular, we are the beneficiaries of that great tradition, and we tamper with it at our peril. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel Cameron. We now extend the 10-minute opening to Dr. Peter Singer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me first begin by rephrasing this debate to some extent, because I actually don't agree with Dr. Cameron that the question, what it means to be human, is an important question. Dr. Cameron gave another alternative rendering of it. What does it mean to be one of us? That's perhaps getting closer, but I also don't think it's quite the right question to ask. Let me just spend a minute or two to say why. If you ask what it means to be human, it's perfectly possible to give that a straightforward biological sense. To be human is to be a member of the species Homo sapien. And a lot of the ethical debates that we've been having, for example, debates about abortion and about research on embryos, has been in terms of the question, are they human beings? As if somehow that would settle the issue. President Bush, for example, in that statement he made on August the 9th, 2001, about research on embryos, said something like, the question is whether they are human and therefore something precious to be protected from destructive research. But I think that that's too swift a move. Because I have no doubt that the embryos that were under discussion that President Bush was talking about are human. They are human in the sense of being members of the species Homo sapien. And I have no doubt that they are alive, so they are living human beings. But for me, that does not answer any significant ethical questions. It just tells you their species, and it tells you that they're alive. Behind that, there is an ethical assumption that if a being is a living human being, then it must have, it ought to have, all of the rights and protections that we want to give ourselves, that we claim for ourselves. And that, I think, is exactly the assumption that you need to think about. It's the assumption that needs to be questioned. You shouldn't make that easy assumption that if a being is biologically a member of our species, that being has the same rights that all of us here have. Because why should species membership be morally crucial? Why should the fact that you biologically belong to this species, you have a certain number of chromosomes, a certain arrangement of the genes, why should that be morally important? Suppose that you encountered a friendly alien. Maybe some of you have been to see E.T. in its revived form recently. Suppose you encounter a being like E.T. who has a range of emotions and feelings at least as deep as we do. and intellect at least as powerful or more powerful than we do. But he's clearly not a human being. No question that E.T. is not a human being, not a member of the species Homo sapien. He's one of these, leathery-skinned aliens, so not a human being. But would anyone think that because E.T. is not a human being, therefore it would be okay to kill him and dissect him to find out how he's going? I think no one who's seen that film could possibly think that the fact that E.T. is not a human being means that E.T. lacks the rights that you or I have. So if that's so, then not being human doesn't mean that you lack rights. And conversely, I would argue that being human doesn't mean necessarily that you have them. So that if we take, for example, and certainly this is an extreme case, but it is a case that exists, if we take an infant born with anencephaly, that is a condition where essentially there is no brain, there is still a brain stem that functions, so anencephalic infants are not brain dead under the law, they are living human beings, but they have no cortex. So we know that they can never, not only can they never learn to think or reason or speak or some of these higher intellectual capacities, they can also never, for example, recognize their mothers. They will never smile when their mother comes into the room and picks them up. They don't have the consciousness required for that. But this is a human being. I would say, however, that this being does not have the same rights to life that you or I, beings with very different capacities, do have because of those capacities and, for example, our abilities to think about our lives, to plan our lives, to have hopes and wishes for the future, all of which I think would make it very seriously wrong to end our lives against our will in a way that it would not be wrong to end the life of an anencephalic infant. And in fact, if you look at the policies, excuse me, you'll get a chance to ask questions later if you'd mind just listening. If you look at the policies that are practiced in every hospital in this country...
Sir, would you kindly sit down? We're going to conduct this in a civil way.
Well, you may judge for yourself whether you consider that a useful contribution to the debate or not, but if I may continue. There is, in every hospital in this country, infants born with anencephaly will not be treated like babies born without that condition. They will not be put on respirators to keep them alive, unless, as happened in one or two very rare cases, the parents, perhaps fundamentalist Christians, will insist on that treatment, and then it may be done. But generally, the vast majority of doctors and parents will think that it's best to allow that child to die. In other words, they're making a judgment that it's better that this child not live. The child could live, perhaps, with intensive care for quite a long time, for years. But in allowing that child to die, a judgment is being made that the child's life is not one that is worth preserving. That's, I think, a reasonable judgment to make. But those who make it, I think, are not following through with that judgment if they say that it's only permissible to allow that infant to die, that it would be wrong to take active steps to assist that infant to die. Because I don't really think that's an important moral distinction. The crucial question is this a being whose life we want to preserve or not? And if we're allowed to decide that we don't want to preserve it, I think the rest is basically a technicality about the means that we use to achieve that end. So let me say then that for that reason, I don't think the important question is whether a being is human or not. The important question is, firstly, is this a being of moral significance to whom we have moral obligations? And my view is that what's required for that is not whether the being is human or not, but whether the being has a capacity to experience anything, to feel pain or suffering, or conversely, to enjoy life. If the being has that capacity, then we can make its life go well or badly, and it makes a difference to that being what its life is like. So yes, then the being is a being of moral significance, and we have moral obligations toward it, basically, at least to try and reduce its suffering, to alleviate its suffering, or to try and make that being's life go better. And this is true generally of human beings, although not, I think, of anencephalics, because they don't have that capacity to feel pleasure or pain. And it's also true, of course, of many non-human animals. At least, I would say, of every vertebrate non-human animal. We could argue about whether it's true of some invertebrates or not. So they are also morally significant beings. And on that question of the suffering of pain, the boundary between our species and theirs is not so crucial. Like them, we can feel pain. They can share those pains too, and it matters. Pain matters whether it's a human, a pig, a chimpanzee, a cow, a chicken, whatever. But a second question can also be asked. Even if a being can feel pain, even if a being is conscious, should it be regarded as having the same right to life that you and I have? Let's say, should it be regarded as having the strongest possible claim to life of any beings that we know? And here I would say, mere consciousness is not enough. Certainly, if a being can have a good life, enjoy a life, that's a reason why it's good for that being to live. But there are worse things than ending the life of a being which does not have any sense of its own life existing over time. And a worse thing is to end the life of a being who can have a sense of existing over time and can want to go on living. Because then you are thwarting the desires and preferences of that being to have his or her life in a way that you cannot do for a being who does not have that capacity. So that's why it seems to me that these are the important things to look at, not the questions of whether beings are human or not, or even the questions of whether they're one of us. Unless by us you mean one of us here, that is, one of us who are capable of understanding an abstract argument, listening to it, and responding intellectually to it. Of course, that's a very narrow group and does not include all human beings, and I wouldn't want to place the threshold so high, even in terms of what kinds of beings have a right to life. Let me just say one final thing. In response to what Dr. Cameron said, I think you need to beware of rhetorical slides of the kind that he used when he moved from speaking of Holland and Oregon, which have laws allowing people to choose to end their lives under certain conditions and with certain safeguards, to Nazi Germany, and to talk about what happened in Nazi Germany as euthanasia. Because the people who were killed by the Nazis, whether in the so-called euthanasia program or simply in the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, wanted to go on living, or certainly did not want to die, nor did their families, nor were their families involved or consenting in the decision that they should not continue to live. It's a completely different situation when you have a state deciding that for its own purposes from what happens in Holland now or in the state of Oregon. And I think you need to think more in a more nuanced way about those distinctions than Dr. Cameron suggested to you. I think I've used my 10 minutes.
I think you have. Thank you. Let me begin with a question for you, Peter Singer. I think that many of those who are concerned, as we can see by the show this evening, many from the disabled community, are concerned with the premise with which you began, that you are perhaps, and I think Dr. Cameron hinted at this in his opening remarks, you're perhaps leading down a moral slope, a brain injury, for example, as opposed to having no brain. I think particularly of my mother in a neurological state where she couldn't communicate, she was lying there with a feeding tube in her, she was immobile, didn't appear to have any consciousness, but may have been in some kind of neurological state where her consciousness was not evident. There are many of those gray areas still medically that can't be defined. So would you address initially the concern that many have that once you begin making the decisions of this sort, in fact you said, we must decide, is this a being whose life we want to preserve or not? First of all, who makes that decision? And then where do you decide not to decide? Or where do you decide the decision has gone too far or just traversed a boundary that is too extreme?
Well, when I said, you sometimes have to decide, I was thinking of cases of infants. And obviously with infants, the infant cannot decide him or herself. So someone has to make that decision. I've always argued that the primary role in decision-making should be that of the parents. The parents are the ones who normally, not in every case, but normally can be expected to have the best interests of their child at heart. They certainly need advice. They certainly need information. Sometimes they can get some information from their physicians, but I think they should be open to the widest range of sources, and I certainly think that those of you here from the disability movement have a role in providing advice to parents about what kind of life their child with a disability can have and how that child can be supported if that's the decision they wish to make. But I think in the end, primarily the decision should be theirs in consultation with their physicians. And only in cases of really rather bizarre decisions where the physicians would not be prepared to go along with that should there be a need to resort to appeal to a higher body, perhaps to a court, perhaps to a bioethics committee or something of that sort. In the case of older people like the ones you mentioned, ideally we should try and ask them beforehand while they're still in a state where they can think about what they would like to happen to them in a range of eventualities which we know could happen to us all. And so they then should be the ones who have that say. It will sometimes happen, nevertheless, that we have no such information. And then it becomes difficult. I think all we can do is make the best judgment we can of what is in the person's interests on the basis of the information that we have. And that's not going to be perfect. But you can't really, you said something, I think, Michael, about deciding not to decide. You can't actually do that in these cases. And not deciding is a decision, one way or the other. It may be not deciding to provide life support and then the patient will die, or it might be not deciding to withdraw life support and then the patient will live. And maybe then the patient will live in pain and distress without any redeeming qualities for 6 months and then die, in which case I would say you've made the wrong decision. So inevitably it is a decision. It can be a tough one, but I think we just have to do the best we can.
And we have to accept the possibility that the wrong decisions can be made and that the technological and biotechnological revolution might even allow for example, infants to be saved from the kind of fate that we might decree upon them, or their parents might decide with physician consultation is the right fate for them?
Well, certainly. I think we are always bound by human fallibility and error. And if I'm right in saying that we have to make a decision either way, then sometimes we'll make decisions that are mistakes. As I said, sometimes we'll keep a child alive who will just suffer miserably and die many months or even years later. Sometimes we will end the life of a child who perhaps could have had a quality of life that we would, had we known what the child would have, thought was much worthwhile. So yes, we can't really avoid making mistakes one way or the other.
Well, Dr. Cameron, I imagine from your perspective that's unacceptable, particularly since you say we all belong to the same human community. But I want to come back to something that Dr. Singer said about why species membership alone should mean moral importance or crucial moral weight. In your judgment, if you would.
Well, one of Peter Singer's contributions to the English language has been his promotion of the term speciesism, which I believe others have also used, but he's very much made it his own, as a way of designating those of us who happen to believe that being a member of the human species is of the highest moral significance, are somehow guilty of the same kind of prejudicial approach as those who would take the view that being a member of this particular sex or ethnic group, sexism, racism, and this is an analogical concept. I think that's a fair assessment of his proposal. And that therefore there must be some other way of deciding who really matters, who is one of us, who is part of the human moral community to whom we will attribute the kind of special character such that we treat them in the way we would treat ourselves. Now, I think without prejudice to the fact that plainly other creatures, whether E.T. Or the so-called lower animal orders, may indeed be accorded special treatment for good reasons, it does seem to me that the indivisibility of human dignity and the, if you like, the moral flip side of human species membership is a bedrock of the kind of vision of human worth in which most of us believe.
Does that make us above the animal world in your judgment then?
It makes us different from the animal world in that it seems to me if our beloved black lab breaks her leg, for example, Miriam, my daughter, is here, who is really her best friend in this world. If Charlie, who is 15 now, I think, were to break her leg, we would have to consider having her put down. If Miriam breaks her leg, I don't think we take that view. And I hope we wouldn't take that view even if Miriam, were 7 times her age and rather elderly. It seems to me we have an intuitive differential in the way in which we regard humans and non-humans for whom we have great affection.
If Miriam were suffering, however, and you saw no end, no plausible end to that suffering, what then?
Well, I would get a different doctor. It seems to me to make a very serious point here. One of the most extraordinary features in this whole discussion, I was at a conference some years ago funded by Sir John Templeton, who you may know is a very wealthy man who funds many very good causes. And we were talking about the capacity of medicine to do things for people who were suffering. And he said that his grandfather had been a physician, which must have been about 100 years ago, because Sir John is now a very old gentleman. And he said that in that 100 years, perhaps we were now 100 times better able to intervene medically and really change the situation when somebody was sick. It's an amazing thing. Palliative medicine goes up like that. The development of the hospice movement goes up like that. My friends in the trade tell me it is very, very rare now for someone to have serious long-term pain that cannot be addressed medically. Very, very rare. And yet, support for euthanasia goes up like that. A generation ago, suffering was much, much greater. And yet, the decision to end someone's life intentionally was something that was not to be considered within the moral community.
What about Dr. Singer's example of an infant born without a brain, without a cortex, no consciousness? Do we, because we have certainly the technology, just prolong that infant's life as the infant continues to grow old and not even consider the possibility that perhaps the infant is in a special category all of its own?
I think the question of anencephaly is a very difficult one. I think that some of you may know that up at Loma Linda there was a scandal, huge controversy, some 20 years ago, when there was interest in taking anencephalic children who had not died and using them as organ donors. And I believe the practice ceased after the controversy. They were considered to be wonderful live organ donors who really were barely human. It seems to me that there are issues of medical futility involved in treating babies who have a very short lifespan ahead of them, and in this case have apparently no consciousness. And I think that is the context in which we have the conversation. I think the notion that we act intentionally to terminate their lives because we consider those lives are not worth living because they are not conscious is a very different question. If I can give a brief parallel case, I mean, the question of the persistent vegetative state is the one typically advanced here also, where people apparently have no consciousness for very long periods. And the record of somebody in PVS is over 30 years of survival in this state. And I was in a debate some years ago, and someone put this to me, and they said, but surely this proves that we should not be sustaining people in this state if they can live that long. And I said, I find the story of this gentleman who was in that state for over 30 years one of the most extraordinary statements of the capacity of the human community to show love for each other in this condition of abject disability.
Peter Singer, I think it's fairly safe to say that much of Nigel Cameron's concern happens to be with not necessarily perhaps defining what is human, but eroding the sense of dignity that we attach to the idea of our humanity. And would you address that concern in as reasonable a way as you can? Because I'm sure that you can empathize with those who feel that once you begin, in other words, to question what is human, you can indeed erode the dignity of what is human.
I think the choice here is whether we are going to essentially try and disguise to ourselves, through the kind of language that Dr. Cameron has used, what actually goes on in medicine, or whether we're going to be honest and face up to it. Because I think that there is a real danger, if we're going to talk about dangers in doing things, I think there's a real danger in prolonging language of fiction. And you had an example from Dr. Cameron when he talked about the futility of prolonging the life of someone with anencephaly because they only have a short lifespan. Babies with anencephaly have a short lifespan because we don't generally put them on respirators. But if you did put them on respirators, there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't, with all the medical technology that, as Dr. Cameron correctly said, has advanced so much in the years, there's no reason why you couldn't keep them alive for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And in what sense is that then futile? Well, of course, you might say, well, it's futile because they'll never recover consciousness. They'll never gain consciousness. But if you admit that that's why it's futile, then essentially you're saying that a human life is futile if it doesn't have consciousness. So you're accepting my point that it's not human life as such, but at least, at a minimum, a level of consciousness that is required to make life worthwhile. So in a whole range of different ways, I think we disguise to ourselves what we're doing. That's just one example. Another example is this idea of relieving pain when we know that we're actually shortening life. But by appealing to this doctrine of double effect, we tell ourselves that our intention is to relieve pain, and this is somehow vastly morally different from actually carrying out active euthanasia, although in both cases we're injecting doses of morphine that are shortening life. And in some cases, actually, we're making the person terminally unconscious. There's a practice in medicine known as terminal sedation, where you make someone unconscious until they die. Of course, if you're prepared to do that, then it's true that there's very, very few people, perhaps none, of whom palliative care cannot relieve pain, as you heard Dr. Cameron say. But do any of you here think that it would be a great idea, if you're terminally ill from cancer, for the doctor to keep you terminally sedated so that you're unconscious until you die, however long that takes? Is that really a lot better than the doctor giving you a single larger injection and killing you straight off, rather than allowing you to die in several weeks? I think not. I think there's a whole range of ways in which we are essentially trying to disguise to ourselves what we're doing, and I see that as dangerous. I also see as dangerous the denial of human freedom and autonomy, and I would say here dignity, that comes from telling people that they're not the ones who are going to choose how their life ends. We, either the doctor or the hospital or the state, are going to tell them how their life is going to end. We are going to tell them that we can relieve their suffering. It may not just be physical pain. It may be other things that are not so easy for palliative care to deal with. It may be weakness. It may be shortness of breath. It may be nausea. It may be the fact that they don't simply want to die in this condition. They don't want to be seen by their family to be have their capacities slowly eroding away. And to say, we are the ones who are going to decide how you die, not you. We are not going to allow you to have those rights and freedoms that the people of the Netherlands or of the state of Oregon now have and the people of Belgium are about to get. That, I think, is indeed something that is more dangerous than the things that I've been suggesting.
Let me take a couple of those points and refer them to Nigel Cameron, because I think they're quite important in terms of the real essence of this debate. That is, Professor Singer is clearly saying that when you talk about the futility of medicine, you're acquiescing to the idea of what's tantamount to the fact that medicine really is ineffectual, therefore acquiescing to a sense what he's saying. But beyond that, I think he's also raising a question about the autonomy of choice, and I'd be curious to know your response to that. That is, if someone can choose a death, they can choose a death with dignity. And since you have made dignity the centerpiece of a lot of your argument, what about that notion that having your own autonomy to die in a dignified way is a death with dignity that you can choose?
I think on the fertility issue, I think my point is that is the context in which you then have that conversation, whether it's about PVS, whether it's about anencephaly. I've never heard anyone suggest an anencephalic can live for 40 years before. This is, we'd have to have some physicians in the conversation to tease this out. But it seems to me that the principle here, there are immensely difficult situations in which we decide, do we treat, do we not treat, do we withdraw treatment because it isn't working? What are the parameters on which we begin and withdraw treatment? And these are very legitimate discussions in which, in a clinical context, we will have a very complex conversation. I think that is a proper conversation to have. I think it is a different conversation in kind from the conversation about whether we intentionally treat or not treat with a view to bringing about the end of the patient's life. And I think that principial distinction is it's part of the wall that divides civilization from barbarism. It's that important. Even if in individual cases, it may be very complex putting together the pieces of the conversation. On the issue of autonomy, I find this a very interesting conversation indeed, because the claim is made, it's made very loosely and believed by many people, that if we are to respect the autonomy of the individual, therefore we should allow euthanasia. It seems obvious, doesn't it? You know, which of the healthcare organizations was it that ran that campaign? It's my life, my body, my healthcare, whatever, something of this kind. And you pursue that argument. And you end up with the notion, and Dr. Singer says this, I mean, who are we to override the wishes of people who want to do A or B or C? And it seems to me if you have a 5-minute conversation about euthanasia, that is the way the discussion goes. Seems to me if you have an hour for the conversation, it goes a very different way, because you begin to run the movies. You begin to look at the scenarios. 2 or 3 key points here. One is, if you actually have a euthanasia regime in law in this country, one of the most immediate impacts it would have would be on health insurance. And we would find health insurance companies offering half-price policies or maybe quarter-price policies to young fit people who agreed that in the event of their getting A or B or C, they would opt for euthanasia. Autonomy, freedom, their choice. So if you're a low-wage earner, as I'm sure some of you are, and you can just afford health insurance, or your company hasn't offered it because they can't, you get cheap policies offered and you make those decisions. And so you say, because you've got 3 kids to support and a mortgage to pay, you will opt for the cheap policy. Now, what's happening to autonomy here? Something very disturbing is happening to it, because you're acting under economic duress and opting into the euthanasia program. Second example, the basic defense, autonomy defense of euthanasia is that if you don't want to be alive because you're sick, you ought not to have to be alive. But who talked about the question of being sick? That isn't the defense of euthanasia. That is the defense of a public policy approval of suicide. Now, how many in this room have not, at one point in their lives, woken up and wished they were dead? Not many of us. It isn't just the bad days we have at work. It isn't just the bad days we have with our families, our kids and our spouses. Many go through depression, experience of depression, long-term depression, and many people have miserable situations for all kinds of reasons. And they might decide, it's my life, I choose not to be alive anymore. The moral justification for euthanasia is in fact a moral case for public policy approval of suicide. And of course the utterly random effects of such a policy are very evident. So I think there are a number of ways in which the easy notion that autonomy leads to euthanasia has led many people working in this field, interestingly, to say, okay, autonomy is impressive, but in this case, we begin to see in public policy, we should say no.
Help us understand a bit how, since you did tie this specifically to religion and you spoke about made in the image of the Creator and all of that, how you mentioned secular in the same fashion, and you say this includes secularism, that embraces the idea behind what you're arguing as a moral civilization and a civilization based on moral humanity. How are those who are non-believers or those who are not faith-anchored included in that?
Well, I know there are some unbelievers here because I know 1 or 2 of you.
Been a litmus test, huh?
It seems to me that there are 2 different issues here. I mean, for example, this discussion of euthanasia, I mean, this is not a religious conversation. It's a conversation about how we protect the weak in a culture in which the temptation to press people into death decisions can be unstoppable unless the culture protects the sanctity of life. Whatever you believe about God or non-God, those arguments I think are very telling. But secondly, I began by saying we are all the legatees of Judeo-Christian civilization, with its amalgam of classical and Judeo-Christian culture, which has given us the rule of law and a certain view of democracy and dignity of the individual, and the human rights movement. The human rights movement, delayed impact of the Enlightenment in public policy, extraordinarily important for the modern world. Now, why are we digging up war graves in Rwanda and in Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia? Why are we doing that? It's because we have a radical view of the dignity of the individual. And that has come to us through our religious heritage. You haven't got to believe the heritage, but let's hold on to the vision of human rights, which ultimately depends upon what Dr. Singer has called our speciesism, our view that to be human is to be uniquely significant.
Peter Singer, you alluded before to what you thought was an unfair rhetorical use by Dr. Cameron of an analogy to what he called German conscience, which obviously is the Nazis. How would you really address to those who are here who are concerned that this does lead to a slippery slope, I hate to use the cliche, that, in other words, there's a potential for eugenics, there's a potential for eliminating people's lives based on their disabilities. There are many people here, obviously, who have that concern. Some of them are protesting outside because they feel once you open this Pandora's box, you've got the possibility of people being eliminated just on the basis of their disability.
Well, essentially, I simply think that the analogy doesn't hold because what the situations that we're dealing with are quite different, and what's being proposed is quite different. On the one hand, you have a totalitarian state with a racist policy based on the preservation of the purity of the Aryan folk, which is, a racial myth, which they consider certain people basically are a blot on the Aryan folk, and they are Jews and Gypsies and people with disabilities, genetic disabilities, inherited disabilities. And this was therefore simply a program to get rid of those people, to eliminate them for the benefit of this mythical state. What I'm talking about is something that is not carried out by an authoritarian state, that is focused on the interests of the individual, and particularly in the case of voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide, on the interest of, on the autonomy of the individual making that decision, and in the other cases, as I said, of the infants, on the family being the nucleus of that decision. I'm not talking about the state coming in and making the decision, and I'm talking about a decision that is always brought down to the level of individual interests.
Please, ma'am, please. I'm going to ask you to be quiet, please. Ma'am, if you don't be quiet, we're going to have you.
Well, let me just say something, because I did hear the word Medicare, and that relates to something that Dr. Cameron said. He referred in discussing voluntary euthanasia to the effect that this might have.
We are trying to conduct an evening here without interruptions, and unfortunately, if you're going to continue to interrupt, I'm going to have you removed. Ma'am, would you please be courteous and let him speak? I understand your feelings. I understand your emotions, but they're inappropriate right now. Let us hear both sides.
What I want to say here is that I think, in fact, it is wrong to allow economic pressures on these issues to determine the questions. And I come from a society which has full medical insurance for every citizen, and I certainly support the idea that in this country too, every citizen should have full national insurance, full healthcare insurance, which would not be subject to their ability to pay and would not be based on whether they are extremely poor. So I accept that there are problems in introducing policies in societies that do not provide adequate coverage, and I certainly think that that coverage ought to be provided. But I think that this is still a situation in which individuals can make decisions. They should be given full support for whichever decision they make, so that parents who decide that they want their disabled child to live should be given full support to have the treatment that that child needs to live, and to have the long-term care that that child will need to have to live the best possible life within the community that that child can live. So I don't think that it should be economic stress or economic burdens. That I agree it doesn't happen, and I think that it's wrong that it doesn't happen. If you'd only stay in the room and we could discuss this, you would find that we perhaps have a lot to agree with in terms of the economic support of the state for people with disabilities, which I totally agree is inadequate. But I don't think that that deals with the question of who should make these decisions, and as I say, it comes back to me that either the individuals themselves or the parents of those children are the ones generally in the best position to reach those decisions.
I understand you're trying to anchor this in family and democracy, but as you can hear by the din, and as certainly you have remarked upon yourself, there's a great sense of inequality. We don't live under a despotic regime, but we do live under a regime that is, or an administration, I should say, that is not fair in terms of equity.
Well, that's a fair point, and I think, you know, if one is to say that this kind of legislation that I'm proposing is desirable in countries that have a national health insurance scheme, which essentially every developed industrialized country except the United States does have, then, you know, I think that's a perfectly reasonable point to make. And you could say that until the United States gets that, perhaps it's not ready for it. I think that's a reasonable argument, but it's not the kind of ringing defense of human dignity that Dr. Cameron was making before. It's a rather odd kind of claim for him to make, given the kind of rhetoric that he started out with.
Dr. Cameron.
Well, it does seem to me it's very interesting. I mean, the notion that in this particular rather sizable democratic society, Dr. Singer accepts that he is himself perturbed about the implications of introducing voluntary euthanasia. It seems to me that this is quite a commentary on the logic of the euthanasia position. You see, once you part company with the notion that we will not, as a community, tolerate the taking of innocent human life, even by yourself, that this is not something public policy will ever approve. Once you part company with that position, Charlie Krauthammer wrote an interesting essay in Washington a few weeks ago talking about the cloning issue, where he said this isn't a slippery slope, it's downhill skiing. And secondly, if you go to Holland in Europe, which is the world's euthanasia lab, serious suggestion, if you haven't been to Holland and you're interested in these issues, go to Holland and spend a week there and meet the guys. You will discover a situation in which there are no strong economic pressures operating to encourage euthanasia, and yet in which many thousands of people who did not volunteer for euthanasia have been killed. And this is a matter of public record in the government's own research into what has been going on, and in which certain persons have been killed, and their killing has been approved by the courts, who were merely depressed because their lives had gone wrong. You will discover a regime within which the tables have been turned. And to give you one example, friend of mine who is an expert on this situation was interviewing one of the best known Dutch euthanasia doctors and said to him, what do you do if an elderly person comes to you and asks to have euthanasia, and it's obvious to you they are under pressure from their children to do this and they don't really want to at all? Now remember, Holland is the high point of autonomy argument for euthanasia. Autonomy, autonomy, autonomy is the case. The doctor replied to my friend, it's a complicated world, I would do it. And here you see autonomy turned precisely on its head. And you see the distinction between so-called voluntary euthanasia and the involuntary euthanasia privatized by the state killing of the Nazis, in effect, elderly people being forced to volunteer for euthanasia. And that's how it'll go.
Let me go...
I
know you want to respond, Dr. Singer. In fact, this will be the final response before we go to the questions from the audience, so I just wanted to alert you to that fact. Certainly we're getting a picture from Dr. Cameron that Holland is really a failure in terms of human dignity, and people are being killed unnecessarily, and you might want to address that as well, if you would.
If I could. I think that's a completely false and misleading picture of what's happening in the Netherlands. And let me just ask you this question before I go into the details. If that were an accurate picture, why would it be that after many years of the open practice of voluntary euthanasia, the Dutch Parliament, democratically elected Parliament, in a society with a very free press, approved the full legalization of this by very strong majorities, essentially close to 2-to-1 majorities, and that the next country in the world to legalize voluntary euthanasia should be the Netherlands' neighbour, Belgium, and the only other country where a majority of the inhabitants speak what is effectively the same language as the Netherlands and can read the Dutch newspapers. In other words, of all the countries in the world, the one you would expect to be best informed on the state of practice of voluntary euthanasia in the Netherlands is Belgium. And that has been the next country to follow that example, and again, by a strong margin, just in the last week or two, the upper house completed the legalization of voluntary euthanasia on similar lines in the Netherlands. Why is this? The reason why it is because, in fact, the citizens of these countries believe that this is giving them the choice that they want to have when they come near the end of their lives. They've seen it in practice, they've known people, relatives or friends, who've used it, and they want it for themselves. In terms of the statistics that Dr. Cameron mentioned, it's true that the government conducted surveys into the number of cases of non-voluntary euthanasia carried out in the Netherlands, and it's true that it found a certain number of cases. Did it find that there were more such cases than in any other country? No, it did not. It did not because there has not been comparable research in any other country, including this country. Together with some colleagues, I attempted to carry out comparable research in Australia. Wasn't easy to do because doctors had to be more secretive about what they were doing, but the not totally conclusive research we carried out suggested that there was more non-voluntary euthanasia going on in Australia than there is in the Netherlands, although voluntary euthanasia is not legal in Australia. The same would be true of this country. Now, in fact, when Dr. Cameron talks of thousands of cases of non-voluntary euthanasia, most of those cases are cases that do happen here. They are cases of doctors who are withdrawing life support knowing that that will end the patient's life and giving doses of morphine where the patient is in pain knowing that that will shorten the patient's life. Those are things, in fact, specifically the last one, that Dr. Cameron himself supports, and yet he is including those in the statistics. Or if he's not including them, then the answer is that there are not thousands of such cases. There are perhaps in the whole of the Netherlands about 1,000 each year, and those cases are overwhelmingly patients whom the doctors believed had less than 24 hours to live and who were no longer competent to make requests about their future. So I don't think that there is, in fact, any sign of a slippery slope in the Netherlands or a situation that is in any way worse from the point of view of people being put to death against their will than is the case in the United States.
And each of you will have 6 minutes at the end to conclude remarks, and Peter Singer, you'll go first in those concluding remarks since Nigel Cameron went first in the opening remarks. I'm going to go to the questions in the audience now, and I'm looking at one here. It says, is there any reasonable middle ground?
Are we both supposed to answer these?
No, actually, it says to both or to either. So why don't you both have a go at it? You want to begin, Peter Singer?
Well, I think that, it's a good question, really, because in some ways, I think that there is less middle ground than many people think. And I think Dr. Cameron, from the radio discussion we had on your program, will agree with that. For example, I think that there is a real problem with a current middle ground position, which says every woman should be able to terminate a pregnancy whenever she wants to, but as soon as a baby is born, its life is sacrosanct and to be protected in the same way as Dr. Cameron's or mine is to be protected. I think that's a difficult middle ground because I don't think that the mere fact that the baby has been delivered makes such a huge difference. If you're allowed to kill a baby in the womb, because you know that it has a disability, that it has, let's say, spina bifida or whatever, a common reason why babies are killed in the womb, then there's a really difficult thing to say that as soon as the baby is born, if you didn't know that it had this condition in the womb, but you would have killed it if it had, now you can no longer kill it. So there is a kind of a middle ground there, and perhaps I'm making some of the people who might have otherwise supported me feel a bit uncomfortable, but I think you do need to think about this situation. Look, I'm really here not to sort of win votes, but to kind of clarify the issues, because I think that's what a philosopher is supposed to do, to help you to think critically about the issues. And if I've helped you to think critically about them, then that's a good thing to do. On the question of not of abortion and infanticide and so on, but on the question of voluntary euthanasia, I suppose there are middle ground positions, though I'm not terribly comfortable with them philosophically, but I guess there are ways of saying, well, look, let's just let doctors give huge amounts of pain relief, and let's say that that's not voluntary euthanasia, but in fact we'll know that they're making patients comfortable when the patients want to, as long as the patients ask for it. There's a kind of pragmatic compromise there, but as I've tried to say, not one that I think really is philosophically on very strong grounds.
Nigel Cameron?
Well, this is the point at which I think Peter and I agree. There were, of course, great outrageous protests when he was appointed at Princeton, and I said to my friends, well, I'm in two minds about this, because through my knowledge of Peter Singer, he wonderfully clarifies debates. And he is a modest and genial man whom I respect and like personally. He believes quite appalling things, which I find impossible in some ways to put into polite language, my response to some of his views, because I think they are absolutely appalling. But he has the great merit of honesty and candor in the way he expresses his position. And for every Peter Singer in the bioethics world, you will find 100 others who will stand here and who will fudge. And I think it is very important for us, and that is why I think to call this the debate of the century is perhaps not entirely immodest. Of course, neither Peter nor I is a native-born American, so we are unable to comment on the use of extravagant language in this context. But it does seem to me that in clarifying this question of whether to be human is what is absolutely, crucially, centrally significant, or whether it's to be human and to be able to do stuff, to be able to have competencies, or maybe not to be human and to be able to do stuff and have competencies. Between those two positions, there is absolutely no middle ground. And those of us who believe in the radical indivisibility of human dignity, I think find ourselves welcoming the clarity which comes from an interlocutor who takes the view that in being human in itself, there is nothing special. It's all a matter of what competencies you have, what morally relevant characteristics you have, to use one of Peter Singer's terms, and who will write a book with a colleague with the title, Should the Baby Live? And answer no.
Well, sometimes I think is the answer.
Peter Singer, I think I don't think I am in agreement with Nigel Cameron in characterizing you as an amiable man and a modest man. But you do certainly evoke a lot of hostility and anger and enmity, as we've witnessed here this evening, and some of it is reflected in some of these questions. So I'm just going to give you a little pastiche here, and maybe you can deal with them accordingly. If all life is equally valuable and therefore equally worth saving, how should limited... Well, wait, no, let me go to something else here. No, I wanted to get to some of the things that I think have a kind of central motif with them. I was misdiagnosed as vegetative state when I had my brain injury. Would your view of human life has saved me or not? I am now 10 years post-injury, walking, talking, and thinking. This comes from someone in the audience who says, Dr. Singer, how have you acquired the knowledge on what adults with severe disabilities need to live happy lives? And this comes from a gentleman who said, I have had cerebral palsy since birth. Can you look me in the face and tell me you think I should be dead? This seems to me to be a pattern. They're all individual, and they're all very distinctly individual, but they seem to represent a kind of collective voice that you have certainly heard before.
Yes, certainly. Let me just answer the last of those questions. The gentleman, or maybe it was a woman, I don't know, with cerebral palsy, who asked, can I look him or her in the face and say, you should not be alive? Certainly not. I'm not going to say that to anyone who is wanting to go on living. I will support your right to life as long as you want to go on living. And I will also, as I said, support the idea that we should not stint on the assistance that the state gives you to integrate as fully as possible into the wider community. But if there comes a point where you say that you find your life is no longer worth living, then I would also support you in, if that's a persistent view that you hold, not just on a whim, not just you get up, as Nigel Cameron said, on one morning with a bad feeling and don't want to go on living. But if over time you persistently take that view and request it, then I would also support your right to end it. If we ask, how does one decide that? Well, as I've said, I don't want to make that decision, but I do think that well-informed parents are the best ones to make it. And, you might say, well, if your parents had had that information, they would not have kept you alive. They would have ended your life. That's perfectly possible. I have to say, there no doubt are people here in the audience whose parents, given this option, might not have kept them alive. Now, there are other people who are not in this audience who might then be alive. For example, it's quite possible. Many couples have a sense of how many children they want to have. If their newborn infant with a disability had died in a week or a month after birth, perhaps they would have gone on to have another child who would now be alive and living, let's say, at least equally as good a life as those of you who are in this audience who feel that your lives were in jeopardy. So I don't myself think, focus only on the tragedy of saying that one of you here in this audience who are having a good life might not have lived if my views had been put into effect. As I say, there may be someone else who is not alive now because you continue to live. And that may be true for any of us, of course, no matter what conditions that we had. What about the possibility of misdiagnosis? I think I did deal with that in an earlier question of yours, Michael. It's true that there can be misdiagnosis. It's true that we want to be as clear as we can about this. And I think, for example, with persistent vegetative state, we should only end life where we have excluded every possible uncertainty. And fortunately, nowadays, we have capacities to produce images of the brain that, at least in some cases, I believe, can exclude such uncertainty. That is, if we can see that the cortex no longer exists, that the part of the brain associated with consciousness has simply turned to fluid, and that is the case of some patients in persistent vegetative state, then we can know that they can never recover. And I think in those cases we can feel that we can end life. We could treat them as we now treat people who are brain dead, which incidentally I think is another of these convenient fictions. The label brain dead is a convenient fiction for not having to sustain people and being able to remove the organs of people who we accept have no continued life that is of any value. But, I think biologically they're alive, they're still warm, their hearts are beating, their blood is circulating, their hair is growing. If they're pregnant, they can gestate babies for months, as actually happened in one case here in Oakland a while ago. So I think that's another fiction. But certainly we should do what we can to avoid these misdiagnoses, but I don't claim that we can ever be 100% certain because of the nature of the fallibility that we're dealing with.
There are a plethora of questions here. We'll get to as many as we can. One way to do this, I think, is to bundle them together in terms of, like I said, there's a good deal of that kind of hostility about would Peter Singer's thesis here apply to people individually who are in the audience and so forth, and I think he's tried to address that. And I'd like Nigel Cameron to address some of what I sense is coming from the audience in opposition to you. Would you agree that Aristotle, for example, and other great thinkers who say that human beings are more noble than other animals, and based upon the evolutionary relationship between humans and chimpanzees, along with recent work done by Jane Goodall and others, which shows differences between humans and chimpanzees is quantitative, not qualitative, how can you make the ethical distinction between humans and chimpanzees? Now, I think these are questions along a similar line. In other words, are you putting humans again into a special category, especially when we're pretty close to orangutans and chimpanzees, obviously.
Where does one begin? It seems to me that the question here is not whether chimpanzees, let us say, can display intelligence and emotion and many of the quasi-human sort of features which they do, and which plainly, we use the term ape. I mean, they ape us. I mean, they're very like us in lots of ways. One does not need to dispute that, or indeed one might well want to take the view that they therefore should be protected from ill treatment of various kinds. And of course, one of the central traditions of our humane culture has been, regulation and law to protect animals from ill treatment. And to control experimentation and so on. That's a huge issue. But it seems to me that we may well want to protect animals from all kinds of ill treatment, and certainly the higher apes. It is a different question, however, from the species question. And I'll make a brief comment on that, because that does seem to me to be what lies at the heart of Peter Singer's critique of the Judeo-Christian tradition, in which humankind is singled out as being uniquely special. And that is that if you take the view, you really only have two views you can take here. At the end of the day, either you take the view that human nature in and of itself is distinct, and that then controls every discussion you have, whether about medical futility, whether about the sanctity of life, whether about how we treat the weak and the powerless. This whole range of questions flows from a vision of human dignity. Or you take the view that there is some kind of amalgam of qualities within human beings and potentially other beings which make certain kinds of beings special and deserving of certain kind of treatment, ultimately in our society of being able to vote and have social security numbers, having a certain status as mature creatures within the community. And Professor Singer's approach, I don't want to put words in his mouth he won't own here. If he weren't here, I might be happy to do that, but he is here. But it seems to me his approach, and he uses this category of what he calls morally relevant characteristics, is to list 6 or 7 competencies. Consciousness, rationality, capacity to communicate, things of that kind, which distinguish a particular individual from other individuals. Now, and he says if you take the view A, you are a speciesist. You take view B, you are responding to the moral claims of persons or potential persons who actually do display some of these qualities. And at one level, there is much appeal in his approach, until you realize what he is doing. Because you see, what he is doing is in fact, and since he uses the ist term, I think we're free to turn it back on him, what in fact he is doing is precisely what, for example, the racist does. The racist, you see, says, well, we have here Homo sapiens, we have the human community, and we will say that certain persons within this community, because of pigmentation, ethnicity, descent, whatever the criterion is, have special character, and we will give them special dignity as over against the others. Now, what he is doing is saying, here we have Homo sapiens, the human community, and certain members of this community, because of their competences, because of what they can do, ultimately, will be singled out for special attention over against the other members of the human community. So it seems to me that the speciesist boot is on the other foot.
As you might imagine, Peter Singer, there are many more questions for you, and I'm trying to think of which would really best represent many people in the audience. This one, it seems to me, is one of those. The term suffering is repeatedly applied to people with disabilities by Peter Singer. What is his definition of suffering, and how do you know people with disabilities suffer because of their disability? Is suffering a cause for murder?
Well, obviously not everybody with a disability is suffering. I've never made any such claim. And lots of people without disability suffer in all sorts of ways. Suffering is a very broad term. It refers to a condition that someone has a strong aversion to, strongly dislikes being in that state. I think that's probably about as specific as I want to get, but we all know that it has degrees, and there's various things that different types of suffering, mental, physical, and so on. How do we know that someone is in that state? Well, I think sometimes we can observe it, particularly with the physical kind. We can observe it. I think we know when animals are suffering. Nigel Cameron talked about his elderly dog and how you might get into a state. I think anyone who's had a dog or a cat might know when there's a time when they make the judgment that that dog or cat's now ill and is suffering and is not likely to recover, and that's just then becomes pointless suffering. And I think one can make the same sorts of judgments, for example, with severely disabled infants in certain conditions, and I think physicians who've looked at some conditions, not all of them obviously, of some certain kinds of disabilities that are involved with fairly extreme suffering, and others that are not. And equally at the end of life, of course, generally conscious beings can tell you, self-aware beings who can use language, can communicate, can tell you that they're suffering. So those are ways that we can know too. But obviously, if you're talking about infants with disabilities who are not actually suffering right there and then, you're making a judgment, you're making a prediction about what their life will be like. And I don't pretend that that's an easy thing to do. It's a difficult decision to make because the conditions, may be varied. They may be cases where there is likely to be psychological suffering, and people will adapt in different ways to those conditions. So I think it's actually difficult to make those judgments, but as I said, I think we do make those judgments either way. We make those judgments when we keep infants alive, when we apply all the powers of modern medical technology to prolonging life, when we ensure that infants who 50 years ago would certainly have died within a week of birth do now live and do now have a life of 10 or 20 or longer years. So that's a decision that we make, and that's therefore based on a judgment, I think, that this life is one that is worth preserving. Conversely, the opposite decision is made on a different judgment.
Excuse me, I just want to follow up with something, because apropos of the difficulty of making those decisions, and just apropos also of what was said about speciesism, This is a question also for you, Peter Singer. How do you rationalize your contrary views of animal rights and infanticide? The requirements that justify existence, autonomy, self-awareness, and rationality are not satisfied by most animals.
Well, indeed, but there's no inconsistency. I think that exactly the same standards ought to be applied. For those of you who are familiar with the fact that I'm the author of a book called Animal Liberation, but have not read it, and you might know that that book argues that we ought to be vegetarians, you might imagine that this argument is made on the basis of the idea that animals have a right to life. But if that is what you think, you ought to go and read the book, because that is nowhere argued in the book. The book is essentially an argument that animals are sentient beings. As I said right at the beginning in my opening statement, they are beings who have the capacity to feel pain, that their pain matters, that we're not justified in ignoring or discounting the significance of pain because the being that feels pain is not a member of our species. And then the book points out in some detail in a couple of long chapters that we inflict a great deal of pain on animals for example, by raising them for food. That this is not a painless process, that this is not a situation in which animals live their normal lives and then suddenly are instantly killed, but it's one in which essentially from the moment of birth through to death, they are simply items of commerce in a vast system of application of modern technology to producing animal products as cheaply as agribusiness can possibly produce them. And that the suffering of those animals in that system counts for nothing as long as it doesn't interfere with the profitability of the system. So that's what the argument is based on. It's based on the idea that we are ignoring the pains and sufferings of sentient beings, not on the idea that they have a right to life. And it's exactly in that way that I defend infanticide or euthanasia for infants in some circumstances, where I think that is also what is in their interests as sentient beings, given the suffering that they are likely to experience if they continue to live. So I don't hold that animals have rights to life that humans of equivalent capacities do not have. It's only where we have the higher capacities that Nigel Cameron mentioned that I think there is a full-fledged right to life. And I think that's something that most, but obviously not all, human beings possess, and that some, but again obviously not all, non-humans possess. Certainly I think the great apes that we mentioned before, the chimpanzees and bonobos and orangutans and gorillas possess it. But how far down it goes, I'm not sure. That's a much more difficult question. So I'm not making the claims I make for animals in terms of anything that's not exactly, should I say, on all fours with the claims that I make for humans.
Nigel Cameron, if all life is equally valuable and therefore equally worth saving, how should limited resources, medical resources, be fairly distributed? I think we've broached this to a degree, but what do you say?
How many hours do we have? It seems to me that is an extraordinarily difficult issue. It's a particularly difficult issue in the context of state healthcare systems. Of course, in the context of private healthcare system, these decisions are made without a central reflection on how you allocate resources. I think, of course, in the context of systems in which you have a pot of money and you decide what we're going to give to immunizing children and what we're going to give to taking care of people with kidney failure and people at end of life, I think these are immensely complex decisions. And I think at one level there's no obvious right or wrong answer, save to engage a moral community of persons who understand the situation professionally, who are physicians and who are nurses, who are patients, into some sense of how we apportion our resources. It's one level, it's the same question. I mean, how do you spend your time if you're a father or a mother and you have to earn money and spend time with your children and look after your aged relatives and help with community groups in the village? I mean, these are all apportionment decisions that we take all the time, typically intuitively, and my response, I think, will be underlined by the comment that if we lose our broad sense of the fundamental dignity of all human life, we lose our capacity to make those intuitive decisions. And we get involved in utilitarian sort of calculus, ordering points, numbers, how we assess this versus that. The intuition of the moral community, on the basis of our common vision of the dignity of every individual, I think is central to our being able to make any kind of moral sense of those decisions.
Let me follow that up with another related question for you, Dr. Cameron. Given your respect for all human life, what is your answer to the overly burdened family of the severely disabled individual? What is your answer for caring for individuals who have no caring family?
Well, of course, an easy answer would be to say the state should provide more resources, or the community, Christians and others, should be more helpful, and such things. It seems to me, though, that the question you raise is that of whether we are able in this world to guarantee persons a certain degree of happiness and sustenance, and we are not. Because we live, Christians believe in a fallen world, we all acknowledge in a world full of disorder, and we have no way of answering the tragedies of individual lives in a way that can guarantee that people can cope with them. I think, however, we as individuals and as communities plainly have extraordinary moral obligations to aid one another at times of crisis and tragedy. And that is an experience which, of course, the September 11 events, I think, have brought home to many people. That we are one global community, we're certainly one national community, and we should be much more concerned with what we can do individually to help others, as well as with devising systems of support which are more able to help them sustain their lives. But we live in a world in which there are no such guarantees.
Well, we've now come to the end of this part of our evening, even though there are so many more questions, and I regret those of you who didn't have your questions included. I'm just looking at some of these questions. They're rather ambitious, like what is the purpose of life? No time, alas, for that. What we'll do instead is we'll have a 6-minute concluding statement of remarks by each of the debaters, participants, and we'll hear first from Peter Singer since Nigel Cameron began.
Thank you very much. Let me just, since this is the last to hear from me, let me thank Nigel Cameron and Michael Krasny and the CBC for putting on this debate, which I think has been, I hope you'll find, a useful and clarifying experience. Let me just say, to really sum up, I think Nigel Cameron's position tries to say, well, look, it's just a matter of being human, and that's really what counts with us. And we don't want to get into anything like looking at the kinds of characteristics that beings have. That's a bad way to go. But I think that that's really a very unsatisfactory answer unless you really are just appealing to some sort of religious doctrine. In other words, just to say, well, you know, we should just take that as a fact. Why is that morally significant, simply being human? I think you have to say something more about that. We want to say that it's worse to kill a human being than it is to kill a cabbage, say, take an extreme example of a being that's not even conscious. And I certainly say, as I said, I think it's worse to kill a human being than it is to kill a chicken or a fish, which are beings that can suffer pain, but I don't think have the kind of self-awareness that I was talking about. And I think you have to say why. And I don't think you can just say because they're human, because of their human nature, or because they're one of us. Those are question-begging answers. I think that really, you know, the reason that Dr. Cameron is defending this is, as he's made clear, because of his Christian beliefs, which, you know, tell him that every human has an immortal soul or something like that, or is made in the image of God, or that God granted us dominion over the animals but not over the humans. And this is really what lies behind it. And, you know, I mean, he's obviously free to hold those beliefs, but I have to say they're not my beliefs, and I don't think they're beliefs that are persuasive to others who don't share that view and who are looking for some different kind of answer. Now, one reason why this is not such a simple answer anyway is that even if you say, well, we want to say they're one of us, part of our community, there's a whole lot of different questions that you have to answer about boundary lines. And I didn't find Dr. Cameron's answers very satisfactory in that way. You have to answer questions about the boundary lines between those of us with capacities and those of us without them. I didn't find his answer on the anencephalic really satisfactory. But you have to also say, why is this difference between humans and non-humans so important? What about at the very beginning of life? Does he want to say that it's as wrong to destroy a single-celled embryo as it is to kill one of us? That is, a being with a full awareness of their life and a desire to go on living. And why should that be so? Because even at the very beginning of the creation of life, there's still boundaries to be drawn. What is the crucial moment supposed to be when you become one of us? Is it when the sperm penetrates the outside of the layer of the egg, or only when the genetic material of the egg and sperm fuse? Why would you choose those boundaries? What is supposed to make a difference in these sorts of cases? What about the fact that we have the capacity to create more lives by dividing the embryos? Should we do that? Or by creating new embryos by taking a nucleus from our own bodies, perhaps, and implanting it into another one? Does every cell in our body then somehow have the capacity for life, and is that also to become one of us? And then there are these boundaries and decisions about between acts and omissions that I've been talking about. Why should you think that it's required by this idea of human dignity and the wider human community? It's required at all costs to avoid intentionally ending a life by active means, but you're allowed to withdraw a respirator. We didn't really get onto this in detail, but certainly most people think that you are allowed to withdraw a respirator from someone, for example, who is, suffering from terminal illness and will only live a few days or a week or two, and who doesn't feel that their life has anything that is worthwhile. Why should that not count as ending a life and is just as contrary to human dignity as actually giving a lethal injection? What about the case of brain death? We haven't had a response from Dr. Cameron on whether he considers that people whose brains have irreversibly ceased to function but whose hearts are still beating and whose bodies are warm are one of us, are members of the human community or not. So there are all these difficult decisions, and the growth in medical technology just makes them more difficult. And that's why I think it's not enough to really just say, well, it's a matter of who is the wider human community. It's something we need to think about a lot more. And let me just finish with one final point I was reminded of when Dr. Cameron referred to the wider global community right at the end. In fact, if we're concerned about human dignity and saving lives, it's very easy for us to save lives at very little cost, if only we would really take seriously this idea that all human life is equally worth living, or even my more limited version, that the lives of all human beings who want to go on living is equally worth living. Because we know that there are close to 10,000 children dying every day from poverty-related causes. And surely every time we go out to a restaurant, every time we spend money on new clothes or CDs or going to the theatre, we could be donating that money to help save these people's lives. But the very people who are strongly against the idea of allowing, for example, voluntary euthanasia, are generally not to be heard in the forefront of those who are saying we must do a lot more, we must really get serious about addressing these issues and not give the token amount that the United States, for example, gives, the lowest of all the economically developed nations, to foreign aid, which ought to be a matter of national shame that people who are concerned about the dignity of human life should be speaking against. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singer. We'll now hear concluding remarks from Dr. Cameron.
Let me first thank Peter Singer for his participation in this occasion. It has been its pleasure to be able to talk about these things in a civilized forum. It's immensely difficult for us to do that when we have strongly held beliefs, and I want to say how much I appreciate those who participated and who have been quiet in our discussion, as well as those who have left after making their points, because I think we have to respect each of us however we feel we can best participate in this difficult conversation. I want to make 3 or 4 quick comments and then a concluding remark. Since Peter Singer launched this international aid development salvo at the end, the gloves are taken off, and I will refer, and of course he can't answer now, to the fact that when some of you have heard in the radio show earlier this week with Michael Krasny, Peter Singer gladly acknowledged his principial support for bestiality, sexual relationships of humans, and I thought very curiously, plainly unconsenting animals, or at least how one reads animal consent, is an interesting question. But having responded in kind, 1 or 2 quick comments on this debate. Brain death issue, the jury is out on brain death from my point of view. I'm unconvinced by the ready acceptance of some 20 years ago of criteria which essentially have determined that persons who still have beating hearts and functioning organs are to be regarded as dead, particularly as the reason why we have done that is to secure a supply of organs for transplantation. I'm uneasy about it. I'm unconvinced on either side. It seems to me it's a matter for further study, and I accept this is an issue which is not easily resolved. Secondly, are we to say that because the Dutch legislature and the Belgians following them think that their euthanasia regime is a good idea, that because the burghers of Amsterdam approve this, all sane persons are going to approve it, when in the first draft of this legislation, children as young as 12 and 13 years old would have been allowed without parental consent to opt for euthanasia. What we see in Holland is the radical corruption of Western civilization, and it's very interesting. Many persons who favor euthanasia have gone visiting, like the British House of Lords Select Committee, loaded with pro-euthanasia people, came back from Holland and said, we don't want euthanasia in this country. Thirdly, animal suffering. I don't think those who favor the animal liberation argumentation need be left to claim the moral weight of this argument, because historically there has been a major concern on the part of our culture for animal welfare. If we are inconsistent, if the suffering of individual animals, let us say in the food production chain, is a matter that has not been adequately addressed, let us address it. We can well address it within the framework of the commitment we have to the uniqueness of human life. Fourthly, the question of the killing of handicapped babies. Should the baby live? No. I find Peter Singer's justification of this essentially in his buy-in to the pro-life argumentation in respect of the continuity of unborn and born human life, which does seem to me to be a statement of the utter obvious. But the continuity of unborn and born human life to be profoundly disturbing. Because, of course, it is one thing to say that the same legitimacy which is held in law to attach to a mother's right to choose to end the life of her fetus with serious handicap should be extended after birth. The logic of that position is that, therefore, the mother's right in law to end the life of her normal fetus for extraneous reasons should be extended after birth also. And what we have here, of course, is the rebirth of the Roman notion of the power of the father to kill his children, which is one of those many features of life in the ancient world that the gospel of Jesus Christ and the triumph of the Judeo-Christian worldview got rid of. But to pull these things together, this is, of all the debates in which we can engage, this is the clearest debate between different views of the world. It's a worldview debate. There are inconsistencies, there are untidinesses on both sides of the stage today. Neither of us is coming with a position which is easy to defend at all points, and which has clarified all of its internal contradictions, and I don't think either of us would claim that. Seems to me, however, and I pick up here my point about the utility of Peter Singer to this debate, which as a utilitarian I think he should appreciate, utter utility of him to this debate is in values clarification, because there is no better conversation into which we can get if we want to understand the significance of the big decisions facing the modern world in its handling of the significance of human life and human dignity. In the Judeo-Christian view of the world, we have God the Creator, we have a world made by Him, we have human beings made by Him in His own image, which would be an utter blasphemy were it not there in Holy Scripture. Human beings of the kind, this is why these war graves in Rwanda and eastern Bosnia are so significant, because these bones being unearthed are of men and women made in the image of God. We have man, male and female, humankind set to rule the world, not as something for our own benefit, but as stewards of God, to whom we must give account. And therefore in our use of the wider environment and of the animal orders, as of our fellow human beings, accountability, moral responsibility is the key. But within that view of the world, there are of course many matters to be addressed, issues of medical futility, issues of resourcing, issues of international development, how it is we spend money coming to this debate rather than sending it off to save the life of a child in Central Africa. Those issues remain to be addressed. The choice we have to make, the choice facing the Western world, is whether we go this way or that, whether we begin with an intuitive commitment on theological or other grounds to the unique dignity, the indivisible dignity of those who are members of Homo sapiens, the human species, or whether we do not. Thank you.
Let me extend thanks to both Peter Singer and Nigel Cameron for an excellent, spirited, illuminating debate. I don't know that we witnessed a debate of the century, but we certainly witnessed an extraordinary debate this evening by both. Also, thanks to the Center for Bioethics and Culture and the Life Legal Defense Fund for sponsoring this evening, and thanks very much to all of you. Good evening.